What is good, everyone? Welcome to the channel. My name is Paul and I make videos about Japanese society, life and culture from the viewpoint of a long-term foreign resident. And I'm throwing another country in the mix today. I'm actually going to be talking about Japan and Singapore because I just got back from a trip to Singapore and I wanted to compare a sort of stereotype or an image that many people who have never been to either place have about both Japan and Singapore, and that is that they are a strict or restrictive society or very conservative in many ways. And from my own observations, it seems to me that there might be some truth to that statement, but actually the way in which each country is strict or conservative or restrictive is actually completely different. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, one thing I want to make very clear from the get-go is that I'm not talking about political left and right, like liberal and conservatism, government policies or anything like that. That's not the purpose of this video. It's more to talk about the difference in the societies and how they can be a bit strict or restrictive and conservative, but not conservative in that political sense. The second thing I'm going to point out is that it's pretty obvious, but while I have 18 years of experience living in Japan to lean on for what I'm going to talk about, I only have 2 weeks in Singapore. So the truth is, I might get some things not completely correct. So if you are from Singapore or you live in Singapore and you can add some details, some nuance, or even correct something that I get wrong, at the end of the day, this is a discussion. I hope you learned something from this video from me, and I'm happy, more than happy, to learn something from you all in the comments. And one final announcement before I get into the 4 items I'm going to talk about today, and that is I have dropped episode 6 of the Journal of Japan Journeys podcast, which is the podcast where I interview other long-term residents of Japan and get their story, why they came to Japan and why they've stayed for so long. And episode 6 is a first for the channel, where I have a guest who actually went so far as to get Japanese citizenship. He's originally from Hong Kong, and that means that he gave up both British and Chinese citizenship to become Japanese. So if that sounds of interest to you, check out the Journal of Japan Journeys podcast. Any major podcast platform you can find, Google, Apple, Spotify, etc. If you just type it in, it'll pop up. So please look for that. All right, so the first one I'm going to talk about is actually first only because it's one of the first things I learned about or sort of observed when I got to Singapore. And that is, compared to Japan, it's a lot more strict or restrictive about the consumption of alcohol. See, in Singapore, it's a lot more expensive to buy alcohol to begin with, and there just seems to be much less overall of a drinking culture there. Obviously, there's people there who drink, and I saw people drinking at the hawker centers, etc., but compared to Japan, not so much. First of all, the expense. A bottle of Suntory, the yellow label whiskey, is going to be about 4 times as expensive in Singapore due to the tax system there. And my understanding is, from talking to someone who lives there, that basically the government is already pretty famous for being restrictive of narcotics and any kind of drugs, etc. And that if they could have gotten away with it, they may have wanted to do something similar to alcohol, but realized they couldn't ban it outright, so the next best thing would be to restrict it through making it prohibitively expensive. And to be perfectly honest, it must be behavior changing, because I was thinking to myself that if I lived there, I'd probably drink a lot less than I do in Japan because it's just too expensive to drink that much. Now, of course, there are bars and clubs and drinking establishments in Singapore, but I think there's far, far less than you would find in Japan. And there's different phenomenon that you discover in Japan that you don't see in Singapore. For example, last train in Japan is packed because everyone has been out drinking and they want to get home without having to pay a taxi fare. So the last trains are absolutely just demolished with people. Whereas in Singapore, these last trains are going to be pretty empty because there's not a lot of people rushing to get home from their drinking party. And in Japan, drinking is almost encouraged. Like, it's such an integral part of socialization. Everything from festivals to, this is still the country you can find drunk salarymen passed out in the bushes next to a station. You're not going to see that in Singapore, very likely. And groups of office workers reeling from one drinking establishment to the next Friday, Saturday night, or even in the middle of the week. It's how you entertain clients and everything else. it's just, let me put it this way. I'm from Wisconsin in the US, and we are famous for being the most drunk state. I drink far more in Japan than I ever did when I lived in Wisconsin. So that should tell you something. So in that sense, we could say that Singapore is much more strict or restrictive, conservative about the consumption of alcohol compared to Japan. And I think that's a pretty obvious one. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is going the other way. A place or an area where Japan is more restrictive. And that is, in Japan, you do have a much greater sense of societal scrutiny, or basically a society that polices itself in terms of behavior. And I'm not talking about just like foreigners living in Japan. I mean for the Japanese themselves. There's just so many rules and manners and things that people follow that, and will notice if someone isn't following, that it's not oppressive, that's too strong a word, but there's the constant kind of level of or feeling of surveillance in that sense. And it's born out of, well, three things really. The first is this idea of kuki o yomu, which is reading the atmosphere. From a very early childhood, children are basically taught and trained that they should always pay attention to others, be cognizant of their surroundings in terms of the social norms and how they should basically conform to what is expected. Part of the reason for kuki o yomu is you don't want to cause meiwaku. Meiwaku means to be troublesome or to cause issues or problems for others. And I guess probably the simplest example of meiwaku is, even though there's no explicit rule, everyone's pretty quiet on trains in Japan. Yes, there's a rule, don't use your cell phone, but it goes beyond that. People just don't speak very loudly. And it's basically this idea, you're in public, you're on a train, you're with all these other people, you don't want to cause them any kind of trouble. And when you get like a group of high school boys, like the baseball team, that are being loud on the train, everyone is secretly, and even not so secretly, firing death glares at them, and everyone's thinking in their mind, oh my god, they're causing so much meiwaku on this train. So the avoidance of meiwaku is one thing, and the other is or Japanese society, I should say, and Japanese people in general are very risk averse. They are not fond of ambiguous or ambiguity in social situations, which is why you have so many more manners and social norms that people follow, because it eliminates that sort of ambiguity or that uncertainty. Fear of uncertainty is a major thing. So that fear of uncertainty is the reason why so many social interactions and societal norms develop in Japan, so that everyone knows what to do given a particular situation or a particular social gathering, etc. So there are a lot of prescribed forms, and you stand out if you don't do it correctly, or people notice if you don't know what to do. And that's the scrutiny I'm talking about, how society kind of polices itself. People notice when you stick out, or when you are meitatsu, like you don't fit in with everyone else. Like a lot of the mask wearing in Japan is because people don't want to meitatsu or stand out. And basically eliminating or lessening uncertainty becomes the goal, just is a general society. And that scrutiny and living in Japan has led me to, whenever I travel abroad, the first couple of days I'm always like being really careful, watching the locals, trying not to do things wrong. Like when I went to Italy a few years ago, and like after a day I realized no one's watching me, no one cares. So I just relaxed and was more free with how I acted. Singapore felt the same way. I did not get the feeling that Singapore people cared what I was doing or how I was doing it in the same way that can exist in Japan. And as such, like, I just relaxed in Singapore and found that it's not a society that is restrictive in that way, that it's going to really kind of pay attention and everyone's watching. Oh, what is the non-Singaporean doing, etc.? Are they doing the social situation correctly? Now, this is something I could be wrong about. I mean, I understand that if you do something bad, or like if you break a law or a regulation or a rule or something in Singapore as a foreigner, you'll get a lot of scrutiny. But that's kind of if you really step out of line. In the day-to-day interactions, I got the impression that that really wasn't the case. That day-to-day, like, you know, going to the hawker center, shopping in a store, like if I didn't know how to order something at a hawker center, like I didn't understand the menu or I couldn't understand the Singapore English that the person was using, which did happen a couple of times, I didn't feel like I was condescended to, or that they even really cared so much. We just got through the communication and life went on. Now, again, I could be wrong about that impression, but it definitely felt like I was once again kind of relieved of the care or worry about what people around me might be thinking of me. Like, as I walk through these streets with no mask on doing this, even though it's technically okay to not have a mask on outside, I still feel like a pressure when people look at me and everyone's wearing masks. Not that kind of pressure in Singapore, to my knowledge. Now, one reason why this culture kind of works in Japan is because it is such a homogenous country. Like, still the vast majority of people are Japanese, were raised in Japanese society and like surroundings. And so it's not strange for such a, you know, the vast majority of people to understand and know what to do given the certain situation. Singapore, it's more understandable that that wouldn't be the case, because you've got a much greater mix, a more multicultural society where you've got, you know, the Chinese majority and then Malaysians next and then Indians and then everyone else. And they've all got their own religions and backgrounds and traditions and things like that. So it's not so surprising that it would be okay for social situations and norms to be more fluid for that. Now, getting into that a little bit deeper, it leads me to my next point, which is Singapore feels a lot more top-down scrutiny. As in, like, Japanese society just generally kind of scrutinizes you that you're doing the right thing. In Singapore, they've much more famously got all of the rules and regulations. And the joke I heard again and again was Singapore is a fine city. Fine meaning it's a lovely, nice place, and fine meaning if you break a rule or you step out of line on a regulation, you're probably going to have to pay some money in the form of a fine. And there's some famous ones that probably everyone knows, but a lot of them can seem really minor to someone like me, like don't drink on the train or in the stations, not even water. Or don't bring a durian fruit because of the smell on the train. You can end up paying 500 Singapore dollars if you do that. So yeah, more of a top-down, and maybe that's part of what makes Singapore really work with all those multicultural, multi-ethnicities. That's it's instead of like homogenous society kind of policing itself, it's more of actual policing, I guess. But that leads me to an observation that's kind of unrelated to today's topic, but I wanted to ask people who are from Singapore or live in Singapore. Something that really struck me about the police is I've been in Singapore for 2 weeks total, right? If I walked around anywhere in Japan for 2 weeks, countryside, city, doesn't matter, I would see a police cruiser patrolling the streets at some point. I would see a policeman standing outside of the Koban police box. I would see police officers walking along the street. It would almost be a daily occurrence by far. Like, I've definitely already seen police patrolling today, for example. However, somehow I managed to spend 2 weeks in Singapore and I never saw a police officer in uniform or what looked like an official police squad car. I mean, there could have been like plainclothes policemen or something that I wouldn't know, but I never saw a uniform. I never saw a police officer in 2 weeks that I was there. And did I just have like an extraordinary stretch of odds there? Or is it that they rely almost entirely upon the surveillance because there are cameras everywhere, it struck me that I just never saw the police at all. And that would be very strange if I didn't see police in Japan in that same stretch of time. Anyway, if you know the answer to that, or you can shed some light on that, please comment in the comment section below. Okay, the next thing I want to get into is perhaps a really obvious one, so I'm not going to talk too deeply about this, but there are more restrictions in Singapore society as a result of the multiculturalism, multi-ethnicities, due to the fact that there's many religions, and those religions have their own restrictions, like dietary restrictions, restrictions on what is allowable as wear and dress. And you can just see this in the day-to-day. For example, like when you go to a hawker center and you see the tray returns, and one will be halal and the other one will be non-halal, so you have to separate the dishes by that as well. So that's not really like a strict or restriction on society, it's more like the followers of each religion. But that is definitely a restriction that you don't see in Japan, because Japan is a very irreligious place. Like, there are very few strict followers of Buddhism or Shinto. Most Shinto traditions have become just that, traditions. They're not religious observations anymore, they're just like societal customs. And while you might have some Buddhist monks who renounce the eating of meat, there's definitely no dietary restrictions in the vast majority of Japanese. So that's definitely a restriction that you see, or it will be more commonly felt in Singapore than in Japan. The final thing I'm going to talk to is actually one where the two countries do have a similarity, and that is what I would call public service announcements, or maybe even propaganda. Both countries, for someone who is coming from America, have a lot more public service announcements just out in society. So like, for example, once I started paying attention in Singapore, I saw a lot of posters and murals and signs that were extolling everyone, you should do this and you should refrain from doing this, etc., etc. And you see that in Japanese stations as well. Japan even takes it a step further and makes it into audio announcements. Like, you will hear, like in train stations and department stores, constant announcements. You should do this, you shouldn't do that, be careful of this, be watchful of that. And speaking of the police patrols again, sometimes those police patrols will actually have a loudspeaker going as they drive around the streets. There was one last fall that I remember where the police car was saying, as it drove down the street, "It's getting dark earlier. Remember to turn your headlights on." It was basically a driving safety announcement, which I thought was, seemed pretty unnecessary. And I guess maybe that's the American in me, but to an American, a lot of that seems a little bit like propaganda. Like, we have to extol what our virtues, and we have to announce and keep people in line through, propaganda messages and the like. But I guess I've gotten used to that in Japan, and so I didn't notice it in Singapore at first. In fact, it was several days before I started actually reading the posters in the train stations and realized, oh, these are really similar to ones you'd see in Japan, just slightly different messages, and obviously in English rather than in Japanese. Alright, once again, thank you very much for watching this particular video. Again, if you have any nuances or other observations that you can make about the things I talked about, I invite you to add them in the comments section below. I really would like to learn what you have to say, and I want to thank you very much for watching this particular video. I had a wonderful time in Singapore both times that I went. Both times were for work, so I hope to go there with my family as soon as possible, because it seems like a lovely country that I absolutely need to spend more time exploring. So thank you so much. I hope to be back as soon as I can. Thank you so much for watching this particular video, and as always, catch you next time. Peace.